Clinical objective tone. Hypericum perforatum, commonly known as St. John's wort, has an extensive historical record as a botanical intervention for depressive disorders. Modern clinical medicine often dismisses herbal treatments as chemically weak supplements, assuming any reported benefits are driven entirely by the placebo effect. Drawing on Cochrane and Linde-Mulrow meta-analyses, this chart compares Hamilton Depression Rating Scores of St. John's wort against standard SSRIs, revealing statistical equivalence. For mild to moderate depression, the botanical extract consistently outperforms placebos, matching the clinical efficacy of low-dose tricyclic antidepressants. These clinical results present a serious dilemma for modern psychiatry. An unregulated botanical extract effectively matches the performance of precision-engineered pharmaceuticals in controlled trials. Translating that efficacy into a real-world clinical setting, however, introduces a severe variable. Most patients requiring psychiatric intervention are already managing other conditions through polypharmacy. When transplant patients taking the immunosuppressant cyclosporin added St. John's wort to their regimen, their bodies rapidly metabolized the anti-rejection drug, leading to organ rejection. Similar chemical failures occur across multiple disease states. The botanical neutralizes oral contraceptives, and it accelerates the clearance of HIV protease inhibitors like indinavir, causing the antiviral therapies to fail. There is also an immediate neurological risk. Combining the plant with traditional synthetic MAOIs or SSRIs often triggers partial serotonin syndrome, a toxic and potentially fatal overstimulation of the central nervous system. St. John's wort operates as a dangerous pharmacokinetic saboteur. Its ability to neutralize other life-saving drugs makes its high clinical efficacy a massive risk for any prescribing physician. This creates a direct clinical contradiction. A single plant successfully treats major depression while actively neutralizing heavily engineered medications across the rest of the body. The plant operates as a complex polypharmaceutical, simultaneously triggering pathways on two completely distinct biological axes. Safely harnessing this treatment requires clinicians to deconstruct its molecular pathways. The mechanism driving the toxicity must be explicitly separated from the mechanism driving the antidepressant efficacy. The mechanism of drug interaction originates entirely outside the brain, beginning inside the liver. The toxic chemical constituent responsible for these systemic failures is a fluoroglycinol derivative called hyperforin. Looking at this diagram of a human hepatocyte, we can track a hyperforin molecule entering the cell and directly binding to a specific transcription factor, known as the pregnane X receptor, or PXR. Once hyperforin activates the PXR, it forms a heterodimer with the retinoid X receptor. This newly formed pair translocates to the nucleus and binds to the cell's DNA. This binding sequence triggers rapid transcription, causing a massive overproduction of the cytochrome P450-3A4 enzyme, flooding the interior of the liver cell. CYP3A4 is the primary metabolic engine the human body uses to process and clear medications. With a surplus of this enzyme active in the liver, co-administered drugs like cyclosporin and indinavir are aggressively metabolized and flushed from the bloodstream before they can take clinical effect. Hyperforin is a potent hepatic inducer. It drives the toxic interactions that render the whole plant clinically unsafe for polypharmacy, and it operates entirely independent of the plant's antidepressant properties. To understand the actual antidepressant mechanism, we have to move from the liver to the central nervous system. The traditional monoamine hypothesis posits that depression is caused by a simple lack of serotonin. This model structurally fails to explain why elevating monoamine levels takes only hours, yet clinical improvement in patients takes several weeks. The stress hypothesis provides a more accurate biological target. It redirects focus from the neurotransmitters floating in the synaptic cleft down to the structural bedrock of the neuron itself, the lipid bilayer. Chronic psychological and physical stress overworks the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, creating a state of hypocortisolemia, or chronically elevated cortisol levels in the brain. This generated video demonstrates the physical pathology of chronic cortisol exposure. The neuronal membrane loses its structural rigidity, becoming highly fluid, disorganized, and chaotic. This hyperfluidity directly compromises the critical signaling proteins embedded within the membrane, specifically the beta-1 adrenergic and 5-HT1A receptors. In this schematic, you can see how the compromised membrane affects function. The receptor diffuses too quickly across the lateral plane. Because it cannot anchor itself, it fails to align with the secondary messenger proteins below it, breaking the signal transduction cascade. At a biophysical level, depression is driven by this breakdown of membrane viscosity. Receptors cannot effectively deliver signals, regardless of the volume of serotonin available in the synapse. Standard extracts typically carry high levels of hyperforin, the very compound that triggers the toxic liver response we saw earlier. Engineering a way to strip away that hyperforin while retaining the plant's lipid remodeling properties led to a highly calibrated extract known as Z117. In vitro lipidomic data shows that Z117 actively reverses the chaotic hyperfluidity caused by chronic cortisol exposure. Looking at this diagram of the neuronal membrane, we can see the primary molecular action of Z117. It upregulates local cholesterol synthesis directly within the membrane. These new cholesterol molecules generate and begin wedging themselves tightly between the scattered phospholipids. The extract initiates a secondary structural repair, altering chain lengths of glycerophospholipids and reducing the phosphatidylcholine to phosphatidylethanolamine ratio to physically stiffen the bilayer. This profound lipid remodeling corrects the chaotic receptor kinetics. The stabilized membrane slows the fast-moving receptor, locking it back into a functional, slow-diffusing state. With the receptors securely anchored in the correct positions, the beta-1 adrenergic and 5-HT1A pathways resume optimal signal transduction. Z117 secures its SSRI-level efficacy by structurally rebuilding the membrane so it can correctly process existing baseline signals, entirely bypassing the need to flood the synapse with excess serotonin. By isolating these two molecular axes, the contradiction between the plant's clinical success and its chemical sabotage resolves clearly. The clinical safety of St. John's wort depends entirely on the chemical extraction process used to create the specific dose. This flowchart illustrates the resulting metabolic pathways. On the left, a high hyperforin extract successfully triggers the membrane efficacy pathway, but simultaneously triggers the toxic CYP3A4 pathway. On the right, the low hyperforin Z117 extract triggers only the membrane pathway. Standard high hyperforin extracts effectively treat depression, but they inevitably trigger the PXR trap in the liver, guaranteeing dangerous drug interactions. The low hyperforin extract Z117 preserves the membrane-stabilizing lipidomic effects in the brain while completely bypassing the hepatic interaction in the liver. Modern clinicians must abandon crude herbal supplementation. Safe polypharmacy demands highly specified mechanism of benefit without the biological sabotage. This targeted lipidomic mechanism forces a reevaluation of the broader psychopharmacology landscape. The action of Z117 directly challenges the standard psychiatric focus on adjusting neurotransmitter quantities as the primary treatment for depressive disorders. Future antidepressant design and research must account for the structural integrity of the lipid bilayer as a primary targetable pathology. True clinical efficacy relies just as much on the physical viscosity of the neuronal membrane as it does on the neurochemicals floating above it.